Welcome to the second section on how to think in React. This time we'll learn how to think about components, component composition, and component reusability. So we're gonna build this beautiful new project over the next few sections. In this section, we lay the foundation of the project by learning deeply about how to split a user interface into components, what type of components we can use, and then how to implement it all in React. We'll also build a simple app layout for the first time using the power of composition. And all these are already intermediate React topics, but still absolutely fundamental for any React developer. So if that sounds like fun, then let's get started. It's time to set up our next project. So we're building a lot of projects here, which is exactly what you need to become the React developer that you want to be. And by now you already know the drill. So just fire up your terminal or your command prompt if you are on Windows, and then simply navigate to the folder that you want to build your next project in. Then type npx create React app at version number 5, please, and then the name of the app, which is use popcorn. So what might that be? That's a bit of a strange name. So let's actually check it out right now. So this is the use popcorn app. And if you want, you can go explore it right now on your own at usepopcorn.netlify.app. So it's called Use Popcorn because this application is all about movies. And maybe you see that this prefix here of the name is this keyword of use, and that reminds you maybe of the use state name. So the name of the use state hook. And so that's because we will build this project over this section and even two other sections. And it is going to be all about hooks, basically. And so that's a hint to that here right in the name. But anyway, here in the search bar, we can now search for movies. So let's say one of my all-time favorite movies called Inception. And this is now loading these movies here from a real API. So we're doing some real data fetching here. Then we can click on any of these movies, which will then take us to this display overview here. Then we can rate the movie. So you see that we have this nice rating component, and this one is definitely a 10. Then it asks us if we want to add the movie to our watch list, and as we say yes, then you see that the movie has indeed been added to our watch list here. Let's say we also saw this one here, maybe it was a 7. Then let's also add it to our list. And you see now we have both of them, and up here we have some statistics about our watch list. We can also delete movies from here. So maybe later I remembered that I didn't actually watch this one. So let's get rid of it. And yeah. So another thing is that when we click here on a movie that we already rated before, then you see that here it no longer displays that rating component, but our actual rating. Then we can always go back by clicking here, or we can also just hit the escape key. So that also works. So that's another small feature right there. And yeah, that's actually it. So a very small application, but again with real data fetching. So that's going to be something really nice that we're going to do for the first time. So this app here might feel already a little bit more real because of that. Now, as I said, we will build this throughout 3 sections. And so in this first section, we will only work with static data yet. So this list of movies here is not yet coming from an API. It's just an array of objects as we have been working with before. The only thing that works here already is the state here. So we can like collapse these two lists here. And we can also already write something here into this search bar. But besides that, in this section, we are more concerned about the component part. So basically creating this layout that we see here, and also talking a bit about component reusability and component composition. And with that being said, let's actually move on to the next lecture where we will learn a bit more about how to think about components. So we're back in a section about thinking in React, which is all about state, data flow, and components. We already talked about state management in detail, and so now it's time to talk more about components. Now, when it comes to components, the important questions that we need to ask ourselves are: how do we split up a UI into components? And when should we actually create new components? So let's try to answer these questions in this video. And one way in which we can start answering those questions is by looking at component size. So we can classify every component based on its size, which means that we can place every component on this axis of component size. On one side, we have really small components, and on the other extreme, we have huge components. And many times, none of these extremes are ideal. So imagine that we wanted to build this simple card. One way of doing it would be to create just one huge component for the entire card. However, that would create a whole set of problems. First, there is way too much stuff going on in this component, so it has way too many responsibilities. So components are just like JavaScript functions, in the sense that if a function does too many different things, we should break it up into multiple functions. And so the same applies to React components. Now, another way in which it becomes apparent that a component is too large is when it needs to receive too many props in order to work properly. So, for example, if we need like 10 or 15 props to properly configure a certain component, that component is probably way too big and should be split up. So, in general, these two problems make it very hard to reuse the component, which is one of the big advantages of components in the first place. Also, huge components generally contain a lot of code that might be complex and intertwined, which ultimately makes the whole component hard to understand and to use. Now, does this mean that we should do the opposite and create many small components like this one? Well, most of the time that would probably be a terrible idea as well. If we would build a UI or an entire app in this way, we would end up with hundreds, if not thousands, of mini components. This, of course, would create a codebase that is super confusing to navigate and to understand, and it would be way too abstracted. And if you're not familiar with the term abstraction, in programming, it basically means to create something new in order to hide the implementation details of that thing. For example, when we create a button component, the user of that component might have no idea how the button actually does what it does, because the implementation details are hidden behind this abstraction, so behind this component. So, in a way, each new component that we create is an abstraction. Now, if both ends of the spectrum, so both really small and huge components have these problems, then what should we do? Well, most of the time, the goal is to create components that strike the right balance between being too specific and too broad. Or in other words, between being too small and being too big. Now, these problems that we identified here, like components having too many responsibilities and being hard to reuse, can help us understand how we should actually split a UI into components. So, using the same example as before, first we had this with just one huge component, and then we had a lot of small components. And both these ways of splitting up the UI are far from ideal, for all the reasons that we have talked about. So instead, what we want is something like this. So here we have a more logical separation of the content into different components, and some of these components are probably even going to be reusable, like the heart button or the superhost label. Also, each of these components has a well-defined responsibility, like displaying the price or the rating, and they're also not overly complex. Okay, and so from this, we can now derive a couple of criteria that we can use to split a user interface into components. First, when we decide which components we need to implement a certain UI, it's important that these components create a logical separation of the content or even of the layout of a page. We should also strive to make some of these components reusable and ensure that each component has a single, well-defined responsibility. Finally, there's one even more subjective criterion, which is your personal coding style. So some people work better with smaller components, and some people just prefer larger components. And therefore, you need to create components in a way that works best for you, so that you can stay as productive as possible. Alright, but now let's actually dig a bit deeper into all these different criteria. So what I want to do in this slide is to give you something like a framework that will help you create new components from bigger components. So the idea is that when you're creating a new component and you're in doubt about what the component should include, just start with a relatively big component, but not a huge component, and then split that bigger component into smaller components as it becomes necessary. But naturally, you will now ask, when does it actually become necessary to split big components into multiple small ones? Well, that's where the 4 criteria come into play again. So logical separation of content, reusability, the responsibilities and complexity of the component, and your personal coding style. Now, of course, if you already know that you need a small and reusable component, such as a button, you can just skip all this and simply create a component. But otherwise, you can just start big and don't need to focus on reusability and complexity at the very beginning. At some point, however, you do need to worry about these topics. And so let's analyze them one by one, starting with logical separation. So if after writing your big component, you feel like the component contains some piece of code or of the layout that don't really belong together, then that means that it's probably a good idea to create a new component. Now about reusability, if it's possible to reuse a part of your big component, and if you actually want or need to reuse that part, then you should take that code and extract it into a new component. Another sign that you should probably extract part of your component into a new one is that your component is doing way too many different things, or that it's relying on too many props. So if your big component has too many pieces of state or effects, or if the code is way too complex or too confusing, it might be, once again, time to create a new, smaller component. And finally, as I said in the previous slide, it's important that you feel productive when working with your components. So if you prefer smaller functions or components, just split up big components into smaller ones. But on the other hand, if you prefer big components, that's also totally fine. It's all up to you. Because remember, in the end, these are all just guidelines and best practices that will become intuitive over time. And by then, building your components will become second nature to you. But as you start out right now, it's great to have guidelines like these to help you out. And speaking of guidelines, I actually have a few more general guidelines for you. So first off, you need to be aware that creating a new component creates a new abstraction. And we talked about abstractions a bit earlier in this lecture, right? Now, abstractions have a cost, because having more abstractions requires more mental energy to think about different components and to switch back and forth between components. So try not to create new components too early if you can avoid it. Next, it's important that you name a component according to what it does or what it displays. And don't be afraid of using long component names. That's completely normal in React development. Now, what's even more important is that you never ever declare a new component inside another component. And we will learn the reason for that in the next section. What you can do instead when you have some related components is to co-locate these related components inside the same file. Finally, and going back to our initial topic of component size, it's completely normal that an application has components of many different sizes, including some very small ones and some huge ones. So even though we said in the beginning that very small components have some problems, of course we always need some small components like these in any application, because they're highly reusable and have very low complexity, which is sometimes exactly what we need. Most apps will also have a few huge components that are not meant to be reused. For example, we might have a huge page component which contains the layout of the entire app or a page. And that might very well be a fairly complex component, which is not meant to be reused. So in situations like this, don't worry about reusability or about needing to split this component up. And speaking of reusability, as you can see from this, we can say that, as a general rule, the reusability range is pretty similar to the size range. So, generally speaking, the smaller components are, the more reusable they will be. And of course, as components get bigger, they will become less reusable. But again, that's no problem at all for some components. So not all components are meant to be reusable. But anyway, finally, we have all these medium-sized components as well, which all have different degrees of size, reusability, responsibility, and complexity. So in the end, our application will have many different components across the entire spectrum, and that's completely normal and natural. And now let's go back to coding and break up a huge component into many small ones, using all the concepts that we have just learned about. So let's now split one huge component into many small ones using the framework that we just learned about. Now, as always, to start, we need to get our starter files here from this folder. So let's grab these two, and then let's move back to our project folder. And as always, I'm renaming it, and then let's paste the new files right in here into the source folder. And then we need to replace these and just get rid of some of this garbage that we have here. All right, so as always, we just end up with index.js, index.css, and app.js. Then we just grab all this and open it in VS Code as always. Close down this one. And yeah, then we need to clean up this file here. And so this is always a little bit of tedious work, but we just have to do it. And actually that's already done. You can take a look here at the CSS if you'd like, because there's actually a lot of it to make this application here work. So to style that application. But what matters most to us is, of course, this app.js. So here we have this array of objects that I talked about in the previous lecture. Here then we have another array of objects, which is for this watched list. And then here we have that huge component that I was talking about. So it has all this JSX inside. So basically all of this, the entire application is now inside of one component. To prove that to you, let's actually start this application here, because this one here is of course still the demo. So let's open up our integrated terminal. That's slightly too big. And then npm start. So that should then open up a new tab in here. And there it is. So make this even smaller. And yeah, so there is the app. And as I was saying in the first lecture, it does work here in terms of collapsing these two lists, also writing something in here. So all of that is working, and it's all working within this one huge component. And so I thought that it was a nice exercise to basically pretend that we're working on some team and that one of our team members created this huge component. And now it's our task to take it and split it up into small components that make it easy to work with and, well, which isn't this huge mess. So let's use the framework that we learned about in the previous lecture to do that. So let's take a look at our JSX here. And if you want, you can of course pause the video and do that on your own, because there is a lot to unpack here. So we have this nav bar here. So this entire thing here is this nav element. And then we have this main part, which is all of this. Then inside the nav, we have this box here for this left side, which contains this list. And then we have another box on the right side, which contains all of this. But we will take care of that later. So for now, let's basically split up all of this here into the nav bar and into this main part. So I think to start, that's the best logical separation of the content, which is, remember, the first criteria that we talked about. So those were logical separation of content, second, reusability, third, responsibilities and complexity, and fourth, the personal coding style. So this navbar here and the main content here, they really don't belong together. And so that's a good idea then to create a component for each of them. So I'm cutting this code here, and I will actually now create these components here on top. Otherwise, I have to scroll too much. So let's write function navbar and then return simply this. Give it a save, and now it's complaining here. So we now need to also move this state here into this other component. So this one here is depending on query and set query, and so therefore we need to move that state right there. And so actually having all the state here was another great indicator that this component here had way too many responsibilities. So we have 5 pieces of state and then these 3 derived states. So that's way too much. So let's just cut this here, paste that here. And here we also need the movies, but I will for now just replace this here with an X. Okay, so now the navbar is gone because of course we haven't yet included it here. And so let's do that. And now our app looks just like before. And so now let's then grab all this other code, all of this, cut it, and put it into yet another component. And this one, let's actually call it main. And as we save it, it will now complain that it needs all of these states here. So for now, let's just grab everything and paste that here. All right. And then, well, we just have to include, of course, that main right here. And then after doing that, the app should look just like before. Well, for some reason it isn't, but let's see that in a minute. For now, I will just take this component here actually back to the top. So just here. Now let's open up our console. Maybe we have some errors here that we're not catching, but well, actually no. But I think I know. And the reason is that here we are not returning. So we were not returning any JSX. And so then of course we couldn't have any JSX here in the UI. Great. So let's keep going and let's look again at our navbar. So our navbar is now a lot simpler than before but it's still doing a lot of different things here, I would say. So we are displaying a logo, we have this input field, and we have the number of results here. Now, in a way, all of this does actually belong together because, well, together they form this navbar. So we could definitely argue that this is okay like this. But on the other hand, it still takes some work to actually figure out what this component here is doing. And maybe we even might want to reuse some parts of it. So for example, this search bar, which is basically this, we might want to reuse it all over the place in the application, at least if the app grew a bit bigger in the future. And so let's at least grab this part here and extract it into its own component. So I'm cutting that. And then let's create a function simply called search. Then return that JSX. And of course, we will then need this state. And we will want to include that here. Give it a save. And then it looks exactly like before. Okay. But now something happened here that I personally really don't like, which is to have one piece of JSX which mixes like these native HTML elements with our custom components. So we have this div, we have this p, but then in the middle we have like our own search. So that I think looks really ugly, and I really don't like that. I think it's quite confusing. And so let's actually also extract the logo and the num results. And so then we make this component here really nice and clean and end up with these three components here where each of them has its own responsibility. So let's create the logo. So we will end up here with a few small and reusable components if we'd like. So we have our logo and then let's say num results. Function num results. All right, this doesn't look quite correct. And yeah, now all we have to do is to include them here. And then num results. And this looks a lot nicer. So as soon as we look at our navbar component, we can immediately see, it contains a logo, a search, and the num results. And from there, if we were interested, we could then really drill down into each of these components if we needed to. And of course, if we wanted, we could even keep going. So we could now create like one component here for the icon and one for the title, so to say. But that would then be that situation in which we would end up with like hundreds of mini components, which really isn't worth it. So this is more than enough. This logo is doing just one thing. So it has one responsibility already, which is basically to display this logo, which is all this. So there's absolutely no need to break it down even further. So this is perfect like this. So the navbar is now finished and we are ready to break up the main component, of course, a lot more as well. So looking at our first criterion, which is the logical separation of content, we clearly have no clear separation right now. So we have one component that has all of this. And so the first visual division that I would make here is to create one component for this box and one for the right one here. And so let's do just that. Take this box. And then let's move down here and create the list box. All right, and I'm calling it the list box. And now we can see. So again, I'm calling this component here the list box because in there is where we will have this list of movies here. So let's now grab the state that is missing here. So set open 1 and the movies. So cutting that from here and placing it here. All right. Now, of course, when you build your own apps in the future, then you will not build one huge component like this. This is just an exercise so that we can apply what we learned before. But again, never build such a huge component like this, because there's really no need to then have all the work of splitting that huge component up like we are doing right now. But I think that, yeah, for learning, this is fun and absolutely no problem. So let's grab this other box as well and place it into the watched box. So function watched box. All right. Let's grab all the state that we need here. And let's also already include both the boxes here. So that's the list box and the watched box. So basically exactly the code that we had here before, now split up into these two components. Placing the state there, and it's not appearing, but that's because, once again, I forgot to return here. Nice. So let's keep going, because I still think that this is way too big. So just looking at this code, it looks quite confusing. You cannot immediately understand what this component here is doing. It has like this button here, which does something, and then we have all of this code down here. And so now what I want to do is to extract this code here into its own list component, which will then have only one responsibility, which is to simply display, well, the list of movies. So let's grab this, cut it from here, and place it right here. So movie list. And I keep forgetting to return. And then here we also need that movies state. And yeah, here then all we need to do is to include that movie list. Nice. And this is still working. Yes, and so we're doing a great job here. So this component is now a lot easier to understand here, if you ask me. So we have one button, and then if that button is open, we show the movie list. Nice. So getting better and better. And I just want to mention that in the real world, we would probably have one file for each of these components. So something I said already many times ago, or many times before, but I still wanted to just mention that here. So we now have this movie list component right here. And for many people, this would now be enough. But if it comes down to my personal coding style or my personal preference, I would actually like to still extract this list element here into its own movie. And we have actually done that many times before already in this application, where we had one component for the list, which would then simply loop over some array and then display one component for each element. And so now I will do exactly the same here. So again, this is now a bit more of my personal preference, but I think that it's actually quite a sensible thing to do, because then here we have the mapping over the array here isolated in this one component, and have then one component which is really only about the movie and nothing else. And again, keep forgetting to return here. And yeah, let's then use that movie here. And what will happen is that we will pass the current movie, so this one here that's coming from the map, as a prop into that component. We will also need this key, no longer here, but now here. And finally accept that prop right here. We give it a save, we have no error, and so let's keep going. So I think we are quite finished here with this left part, and so let's go over here. Now here we can already see that it's a bit more complex, because here we have not only the list, but also like this summary of the list. But let's see what we actually have there. So it's inside this watched box. And of course, we can also start seeing our components tree right here, which is always nice. So I always like to do that, actually. And so it's coming together here quite nicely. Maybe it doesn't even have to be this big. Then we can see a bit better. And so, yeah, this is exactly what we have been building. And now all we have to do is to also break up this watched box a bit better. So let's take care of that. And first up, I will do that division that I just mentioned earlier. So we have this list here and also this summary. So let's grab that summary here. And so that's basically this div with the class name of summary. So I'm cutting that. And then let's just create function watched summary. And then returning this. So now this code here actually depends on a few things. So all of these variables. So let's see what they are. So that's these variables right here plus the watched. Now we could pass all of these three here individually, or actually the four of them. So watched plus these three here. So we could pass them into the watched box component that we just created. But actually, if we take a look at them, all of them simply depend on the watched state. And so what we're going to do is to grab this and pass this watched list, so that array, right here as a prop. Okay, moving there, pasting that here. And of course we need to accept that prop then here. And now React is happy again. So again, what we did is that these three pieces here are derived state, and they are derived from this watched array right here. And so we simply passed the watched array into this component and then, yeah, just moved these three here, of course, also into this component. And so we did that instead of leaving this here in the parent component and passing all of them one by one. But this code here clearly belongs in this component. So it's clearly part of the responsibility of watched summary to calculate its own statistics. And if all it needs to do that is this watched array, well, then we are happy to provide it with exactly that array. But moving on, let's now create another list, which is here for this watched. So this watched movies list. So cut that as well. So let's call this one here the watch list. And of course, we could have also called it the watched movie list. And let's actually do that. So remember how I said that we should not be afraid of long component names. And so I think that this is a bit better actually. Now here we will need that watched array. So that piece of state that we have up here. Right, but let's first give it a save and then see that error. And, well, nothing really happened here. Well, first of all, we have a bug here, and it's a big one, which is that we are here including the same component inside itself. So we are including watched box inside watched box. So this was by mistake. Probably you have noticed this as I was typing. So here, of course, it needs to be the watched summary, which is the component that we were talking about before. But still nothing is happening. So let's try to reload here. But now we have like this infinite loop. So maybe we have some errors, but yeah, I think the best thing to do is to actually quit the application altogether and then just try to restart. So let's wait for it. And yeah, let's close the old one. And now we get that error that we had before. So before I fix that, or actually let's pass it in already here, but I still wanted to say that it's really, really important that you do not call the component inside of itself. So again, I was calling watched box in here. And so the problem was that this then created an infinite loop of the component calling itself. And so that's why when I was reloading the application, React here wasn't really reacting. So the application wasn't really able to then render itself. And again, because of that infinite loop. So never do what I just did here by mistake. But anyway, we now passed the watched array here into this watched movies list. And so here we just need to receive that, give it a save, and then we are back to normal. Let's quickly get our console back. And yeah, so this is the list that we have. And now just one more component where, just like before, I will extract the list item into its own component. So grabbing all of this, let's create the watched movie. Here we already know that we need to accept the movie. And here, remember, it's very important that we place the prop name into these curly braces, because we are, in fact, just destructuring the props object. Right. And so then here, all we have to do is to write watched movie, pass in the movie prop. And yeah, we also need this key right here. And with this, we should be done. And we are indeed. So the app works and looks just like before. But we now divided this application into its logical components. So components that have a logical separation of the content, that might be reusable, and that have the right number of responsibilities and of complexity. Now that we have created a few different components, let's quickly talk about different component categories that naturally emerge in most React code bases. So most of your components will naturally fall into one of three categories: stateless or presentational components, stateful components, or structural components. And I say naturally because we shouldn't force our components into one of these categories. Now, these are all still normal React components in our code, so just like the ones that we have been writing, but we can categorize them in this way when we think about components. There are also other categories that could be used, but I think that these make the most sense. So, starting with stateless or presentational components, as the name says, these don't have any state. Usually, they are components that receive some props, and then they simply present that data or even some other content, and therefore the name presentational. Many times, these are quite small components, such as the logo, num results, and movie components in our current app. Next, stateful components are simply components that do have state. Now, just because these components have state, that doesn't mean that they can't be highly reusable. For example, the search component that we built does have state, and we could reuse this input as many times as we wanted throughout the app. Now, finally, you can think of structural components as pages, layouts, or screens of the application, which are oftentimes the result of composing many smaller components together. And more about composition later in this section. So, these structural components can be large and non-reusable components, but they don't have to. Structural components are sometimes quite small too. What matters is that they are responsible for providing some sort of structure to applications, such as pages or layouts. Therefore, these components might not be present in really small apps, but you will definitely have a few structural components as your app grows bigger and bigger. Now, we left a small problem in one of the components that we just created earlier. And so let's now go fix that problem and, in the process, discover the problem of prop drilling. But before we go do that, I just want to very quickly review the previous lecture by classifying each of our components into one of the categories that we just looked at. So I think that clearly both the app and the navbar component here are structural components. So they're only responsible for the structure or for the layout of the application. And the same can also be said of this main component here. So those are for providing structure. Then the logo here is clearly a presentational component, so it doesn't have any state, and so therefore it's stateless, and it simply presents some content here. Then the search is of course a stateful component. Then num_results is just a presentational component here. Main we already talked about. Then we have the list box, which clearly is a stateful component. And the same for the movie list and for the watched box. So those are all stateful components, while the movie simply receives this prop right here and then presents that data in the user interface. And so movie here is just a stateless or presentational component. Then we have this one here, which is also a presentational component. And the same for this one. So watched movies list and watched movie. All right, and that's actually it. I just wanted to quickly categorize each of them. But now let's move on to that problem that I mentioned in the very beginning. And that is that right now, here we are not dynamically calculating the number of results. So we are not basically taking the list of movies and reading how many there are and then displaying it here. So that's what we want to do. But yeah, now we only have this X. So what we need basically is to get access to the movies state right here in num_results. Now, where does that state live right now? Well, it's here inside of movies list. So right here. So again, it's here, but we also need it here in num_results. So what's the solution to that? And I really hope you already know at this point. Well, the solution is to lift the state up to the closest parent component. And what parent is that? Well, it's the app component, right? So it's not the navbar, because of course that's not a parent of movie list, and so it is really the app component. So what we need to do is to cut this from here and place it right back into the app component. All right, and now we need to pass it down as a prop to where we need it. And so this is where the problem of prop drilling will come into play. So again, we need now this state in order to make this work again inside of the movie list. But this movie list is really deeply nested inside this component tree, right? So it has these two parent components, which now will also need to receive that state as a prop. But instead of talking, let's actually do this. So movies equals movies. So now we have the movies array inside main. So let's go there. And we need to receive it here. And then we need to pass it here right into the watched box, or actually into the list box. So movies equal movies. Or actually here, yeah, it's not main, of course, it's movies. Okay, so now we got it inside the main, and now we got it inside the list box. So let's come here and do it all again. So accepting it here, and then passing it here. So movies equal movies. And so what we are doing right now is what we call prop drilling. So now we finally accept it here, and then it works again. So basically prop drilling means that we need to pass some prop through several nested child components in order to get that data into some deeply nested component, which in this case is this one. So we had to pass this movies prop here first into the main, then, well, from the main into the list box, and then from the list box into the movie list. And so all these components, they didn't actually even need this prop. All they needed this for was to then pass it down even further the tree. And so we end up with a lot of props that are really not needed at all. All they are needed for is to pass the data down even further into our component tree. So this is what prop drilling is, and you saw that it is not a lot of fun, and it could be even worse, of course, if the data was nested even deeper into the tree. So this was just like 3 levels deep, but it could be like 5 or 10 levels. And so then it would become a little bit out of control. So we will look at ways of fixing prop drilling a bit later in this section, but for now, let's finally also make this prop, so this movies data, available right here where we also need it. So right here. So movies equal movies. And so now we have to do some prop drilling again, because here we need to again accept this prop, but we don't need it here. All we need it for is to pass it down again. But here it's not so bad because it's really just one level. Okay, and now finally movies dot length. And so, ta-da, we got 3 results. Nice. So this works, and what we just did here is a perfectly valid solution to make the application work, of course. But as I mentioned, what we did was some so-called prop drilling, which is not always the best solution, especially if we need to pass that prop down really, really deep into the tree. And so in the next lecture, we will take a look at one of the possible solutions to this problem, which is component composition. As we keep learning about components in this section, there is one essential principle that we really need to focus on now, which is component composition. Now, in order to talk about component composition, we first need to take a look at what happens when we simply use or include a component in another component in JSX. So let's say that we have this modal component that we want to reuse, and also this success component, which simply renders the message well done. And then we just use the success component inside the modal component like this. And this sort of thing is exactly what we have been doing with our components most of the time, right? So we just use them inside of other components. However, when it comes to reusability, this creates a big problem. That's because right now, the success component really is inside of modal. They are deeply linked together in the JSX right now. And therefore, we cannot reuse this modal component to display some other message inside of it. For example, an error message. But as you can imagine, in order to solve this, we now bring in the technique of component composition, where we can compose the modal and success components together. So here we have our modal component again, but with a fundamental difference. So this component does not include a predefined component, but instead it accepts children with the children prop. So just like we have learned before. So if we get our success component again, we can now basically just pass it into the modal by placing it between the opening and closing tags when we use modal. And if you need a minute to analyze this code a bit better, feel free to just pause the video right now. Because I want you to really grasp the fundamental difference here. So in the first example, the success component is really tied to the modal. And so that modal might as well be called a success modal, because we can't use it for anything else anymore. But with component composition, we simply passed the success component right into the modal and composed them together in this way. And again, this works thanks to the children prop. Now, of course, we could have passed in any other component, which makes the modal component highly reusable. So essentially, when we do component composition, we leave this hole or this empty slot in the component, ready to be filled with any other component that we want. So let's say that later we needed another modal window somewhere else in the app, but one that renders this error message. Well, that's pretty easy now. We just use the modal component again, but this time we pass in the error component as a children. And with this, we have also successfully composed these two components together as well. So formally, component composition is the technique of combining different components by using the children prop or by explicitly defining components as props. Now, we use composition for two big reasons, or in two important situations. First, when we want to create highly reusable and flexible components, such as the modal window, or really a million other reusable components that we can think of. And we do this really all the time. Now, the second situation in which we can use composition is in order to fix a prop drilling problem like the one that we found in the previous video. And this is actually great for creating layouts, as we will do in the next video. Just keep in mind, once again, that this is only possible because components do not need to know their children in advance, which allows us to leave these empty slots inside of them in the form of the children prop. And with that being said, let's return to our project. So let's now use component composition in order to fix the prop drilling problem that we have just encountered before. And in the process, we will also find a way better solution to building layouts in React applications. And let's start by fixing the easy prop drilling problem, which is the one where we pass the movies prop into the navbar, and then from the navbar, we pass it here into the num results. So here we only have one level of prop drilling. Now, you might be wondering, how can we use component composition in order to solve this problem? Well, what if we could use the num results component right here in the app component instead of in the navbar? Then we wouldn't have to pass in this movies prop into the navbar, right? Which would then fix that prop drilling problem. So we can actually do that with component composition. So let me show you how. So here, instead of accepting the movies, let's accept children. And so this is then that empty slot that we talked about in the previous lecture. And so now here in the navbar, instead of closing it right here, let's have an opening tag and a closing tag. And then between these two, we can just grab this, place that here, and then just include those children. And that's it, actually. So give it a save. The app looks exactly the same as before, but we have eliminated the prop drilling problem, right? Because now we are using num results right here in the component where the state actually lives. So the movies state in this case. And so then we can pass it directly into the component right here, which is the one that actually needs it. So num results is not an intermediary component, just like navbar was before. And so of course then here we can finally and terminally remove it. And so this then really shows that the prop drilling has been eliminated, and all by using component composition, where we now basically composed the navbar together with these three other components here. So these three is what are becoming the children of the navbar. And so here, again, we then accept those children and simply display them here. We could also say, for example, that we do not need to display or to include the logo right here. So we could, for example, cut it here and place it here. And then it works just exactly the same as before. So this logo here is just completely stateless anyway, and it's not really relevant to the app. And so we could say that it should always be a part of the nav bar. But maybe these two here can be optional. So with this, we can very easily later say that, well, maybe we don't need a search here. So remove it, and there you go. We didn't even have to touch the nav bar at all. All we had to do was to come into our application, where we now have an easier way of seeing basically the overall layout of the application. Let's of course put it back, and then let's fix the worst problem of prop drilling that we also have, which is here for this movies list. So let's do the same with the main component here. And here remember that we actually need to pass the movies prop through several layers. So we pass it from app into main into here the list box. And so we can remove, again, all these intermediary steps. So here in the main, let's no longer accept the movies and instead accept children. So then let's remove the watch box from here, or actually the list box, or actually why not both of them? So let's cut them from here, say children, and then we can do the same thing as before. So here now we get rid of this. Let's close it, and then just place these two here, and we can then no longer pass the movies into the main element or the main component, because that one no longer needs it. I mean, as you know, it never even needed it in the first place. It only needed it to pass it further down the tree. But now the tree is basically built in a different way. And so then, again, this component no longer needs that prop. Nice. And so, actually, we can keep going. So we can just do exactly the same thing here to the list box, because that list box also doesn't need the movies, really. It's also just passing it down. And so let's remove it. So let's grab this, cut it from here. So this will now become the empty slot here inside this list box component. So remove that. Do the same thing as before. Of course, we need to close it here. And well, that's taking a bit too long. Let's manually reload here. And still that's not working. But yeah, the code should be correct. Let me just remove this from here now. And I will simply close the app and run it again. So it's the second time we needed to do this in this section so far, but sometimes that can happen. Well, apparently this is not the solution this time. So let's see if we have some error here. And actually, yeah, sometimes it's a good idea, as I said right in the beginning of the course, to actually read the errors here. So it says objects are not valid as a React child. So let's go back to our movie list, or to the list box, actually, which is the one that we just did something in. And yeah, the problem is actually right here. So here we were basically creating a new object, which is not necessary. All we need to do here is to really conditionally render this children prop. So give it a save, and there we go. Just reload again to get rid of the errors, and that's it. So now we are essentially directly passing the movies prop right here into the movies list from the app component. So as I just said, we are in the app component, and now, thanks to all this composition here, we can pass the movies directly into the movies list, which is in fact the only component that does actually need it. Not this one, but only this one. And of course, also this one. Great. So this is actually a really, really nice way of building layouts in React applications. So just by looking at the return JSX from the app component, we can nicely see the entire layout and also basically the entire component tree. So what we have here is indeed very similar to what we can observe right here. So we have the app, which has the navbar, which in turn has the search and num results. And we have the main, which has the list box, it has the watched box, and then that one also has some stuff in it. So here we didn't do the component composition yet, but we will do very soon. For now, I want to take a break here, and I want you to analyze this code on your own for a few minutes. So really understand the deep difference between the code that we had before and the code that we have right now. And if necessary, you can also re-watch the previous lecture in which I explained exactly what is happening as well. So again, please take now 5 or 10 minutes to do that, and then let's move on to the next video. So we used composition in order to solve a prop drilling problem and to build our layout in a way nicer way. And so now let's use it to build a reusable box component. So we already converted the list box component here to use the children prop in order to then basically fill that slot, so that hole, with this component that we pass in as a child component. And so now we could go ahead and do the exact same thing with the watched box. So let's actually go there. So watch box, and it's right here. However, if we take a look at this component right here, it is very, very similar to that other box. So to that list box. So basically both of them have this state here of is open. Then they have a div with the class of box. And then they have this button, which is also exactly the same. And in the end, they will render their children conditionally. So based on the is open state. So again, if we go here, we will see that it is basically exactly the same. This one here has this watched state, but we can easily move that somewhere else. So what I'm saying is that both the watched box and the movie box have this same state here. Basically, they have this same class name, this same button, and then they render something conditionally based on the open state. And so this is an amazing candidate to create a reusable component. So let's do that. And let's do it separately, actually, of the other ones. And I will simply call it box. Let me, just to make this a bit easier, cut this one and paste it close to the other one. And then we can see how similar they actually are. And you know what? I will actually not create a new one, but I will immediately convert this one here, because the list box is basically already what we want. So let's just recall it box. Then here we no longer need like this name here of isOpen1 and set isOpen1. Let's change that here, and here. And that's already it. So we no longer need this watched box. So let's completely comment that one out. And so let's now use this box here inside of this list box that we're using. So box right here. Let's remove that one for now. And box here as well. And well, for some, I had the wrong one here open still. So just to make sure, let's reload. And so this part still looks exactly the same as before. And so now we can use this reusable box and simply pass in that content that we passed before into the watched box, which is basically this. Right? So copy that and let's paste that here. And now we get the problem which I was saying before, which is that this watched array here now needs to be moved onto this component. So this state that we had before can no longer live here, but it couldn't anyway, as we will see in a future section. So we would have to place this here anyway. And so yeah, this fixes the problem. And we shouldn't even need this right here. And so there we go. We just created ourselves a reusable box component, and the state now works, of course, still in both. And so we didn't have to rewrite that same state logic and the same button here in both of these lists, because again, they were basically exactly the same. And so what we did, again, was to create this reusable box and in there allow for any children to be passed in. So we created like this empty hole here, ready to receive any components that we want, which in this case is the movies list, and in this case, it's the watched summary and the watched list. So here we have just one children component, and here we have two. But no matter what, our box always works for all of these situations. And so again, all of this logic here, so this button here with setting the open state could just be reused in this way. And on top of that, as a bonus, we made our application tree here even more explicit in the app component. So now it really is very clear what exactly is happening in the application just by looking at this one component. We can immediately see the entire structure of the application, which is really, really helpful. So this is really great, and we're moving into some more intermediate React territory. But that makes complete sense because we are already in part 2, which is exactly for intermediate React. So it's great that at this point we are already able to do something like this, which is already way closer to how real-world React applications look like. So really, really keep this technique of component composition in mind, both for building better layouts, for solving prop drilling, and also for creating reusable components like this one. So hopefully you saw how powerful this is. And so as you start writing your own code, be on the watch out for whenever you can do this. So whenever you can create some reusable components in your own code using this amazing technique. In the lecture about component composition, I said that we can use the children prop for composition or an explicitly defined prop. And so let's now quickly explore that second option. So instead of using the children prop in a component and then passing in a component like this, we can use an explicit prop as an alternative. So let me show you what I mean by first commenting out all of this. And then we can go to the box component. So down here. And now, instead of accepting children here, let's say we accept something called element. And it can really be called anything. So just L or really whatever. And so now we can go back up here and include the box in the old way. So closing it immediately, but then we can specify the element prop. And now here we can then do exactly what we had here. So let's copy that and paste it, give it a save, and that worked. So now we have our movie list like here, and it was passed into the box component as an explicit prop. In this case, a prop called element. So before, what we had here is that we were basically implicitly passing in this component into the box, and then we read it there with the children prop. But here we now basically pass it in more explicitly. So we really say that we have an element prop, and then we place whatever we want to pass in right here. So right into the element prop. And this pattern is used in some library, for example, in React Router. And so this is why I thought it might be interesting to show this to you right now. And of course, we can do the same with the other box here. So simply saying element and then this. Now here, basically, we are passing in a brand new piece of JSX. And so here, we now actually need a fragment. Give it a save, and there we go. So the app now looks exactly the same as before, but we basically passed in an element or multiple elements here instead of using the children prop. But the result is exactly the same. And under the hood, inside React, it should also be basically exactly the same. So this can be a viable pattern in case you need to pass in multiple elements and give them separate names. So that would be a perfectly fine use case for using something like an element prop or really any other prop with any other name instead of the implicit children prop. But in our case, let's go back to what we had before, because I think it looks a lot nicer actually, and it's also clearly the preferred way of doing this inside React. So this was really just to show you. So I will just delete this entire code and put this one here back. And then let's go to the box and fix it there as well. And by the way, let me show you a very nice trick in VS Code, which is that if you hover over any component here and then hit Command on the Mac or Control on Windows, we can actually go right to the definition of the function. So in this case, of the component. So I'm hovering box here, then I hit the Command key, click, and then I immediately move there. And what's even nicer is that if we do the same down here, so again, hitting the Command or the Control key, then we go right back up. Well, in this case, somehow it doesn't work, but usually it should. But yeah, what matters is that we can move from where the component is called into the place where it is actually defined. And so now let's change element back to children, and then we have just what we had before. So this was really just to show you an alternative way of using component composition without the children prop. But again, using children is by far the preferred way of doing things. Let's now take a break from building our project and build a small, reusable, and flexible star rating component. So what we want to build is a component like this one. So it displays multiple stars, and then as we hover over them, it displays the currently selected rating here on the right side. So as you see, as we hover over the stars, it always shows the currently selected number of stars, and if we click here, then that number stays fixed. And if we then click again, because this movie is definitely a 10, then of course we can also change that rating. Okay, now we will develop this component here in complete isolation, so outside of this current application, so that we could reuse it anywhere we wanted and also make it really flexible by allowing for different props. For example, here we can rate between 0 and 10 right now, but we will make it so that the user of the component can choose what number of stars they want to display. And that's just one of the things that we will do. But anyway, let's now come here to our project, and then let's create a brand new component file here. So star rating, and then export default function, and then the name of the component. So star rating, and for now we won't accept any props here. We will leave that for later. And now let's just return something here. And now what I want to do is to actually come to the index.js file and then no longer import the app here for now, and also not the CSS file. Because again, this component should be completely reusable, and so it shouldn't depend on any external CSS files. So instead, what I want to do now is to import that star rating. And you see that VS Code automatically wrote our import statement here. And if for some reason your VS Code didn't help you with this autocomplete, then just make sure to type exactly this. Then finally, we also need to remove this one here temporarily and instead include our star rating here. And I'm doing it like this just so that we don't have to create a brand new project just for building this one component. So for now, we will just use this project that we already have instead of creating a new Create React app. But anyway, let's give it a save now. And now here you see that hello that's coming from here, so from the star rating. So let's close the app and this sidebar, and then let's get started. So starting with the JSX here, so just with the structure, we see that we have basically two main elements. So we have one container for all these stars, and we have then like this message here, so the current rating on the right side. So inside our div, let's place another div for those stars, and then one paragraph for that message. So for now, let me just place a number here. And here for the stars, we want to dynamically generate these star elements. So instead of writing them by hand one by one, because that's the only way in which we could sometimes have 5 stars, in other situations 10 stars, or really any other number. So let's use the technique that we used before in the far away app. So entering JavaScript mode, and then we can write array.from. And here we can then specify an object with the length property. And let's set it here to 5 initially. And so this then creates an empty array with 5 elements that we can then immediately loop over by passing in a function, so like a map function, here as the second argument. So in this function, we are not interested in the elements themselves. So let's just use a placeholder variable, but we are interested here in the number. All right, and now here we can just render anything. Let's just do a span element for now, but later we will place the stars in here. So let's just write S for star, and then here the number. And actually this should be S plus 1, because I, of course, is 0 based here. Okay, and this should already be something. And indeed, we see star 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which of course, again, are just placeholders for now. Here we have some error, which probably, yeah, it's because of that key prop. So let's add that key here. Well, actually we don't, because this is just temporary anyway. Okay, so now let's define some styles here. And remember how I said initially that we cannot depend on any external CSS file or CSS classes. And therefore, we need to define all our styles inline. So let's do that, starting here with the parent element. And so here we now need to specify an object. And why not actually do that here as a separate object outside? So let's write container style. Then let's set the display property to flex. So to place the two elements side by side. Then align items. Let's set that one to center, which will align the items vertically. And then let's also specify a gap of 16 pixels. Okay, and now here we can just specify that. Give it a save, and that looks already a bit better. And now we can do even better, which is to take this entire object, which will never change, and it doesn't depend on anything that is here in the component, and we can place it completely outside of the component. And by doing so, this object here will not have to be regenerated by JavaScript each time that this component here re-renders. Because otherwise, each time that the component does re-render, this function will get called again, and so then this object would also get regenerated again. And so that's not necessary, and so we can just place it outside here. Now next, let's also create some styles for the other container. So this container here with the stars. So let's say star container style. So let's also do display flex and then give it a gap here of just 4 pixels for now. All right. And finally, just some styling here for the text. So text style, let's say line height. Yeah, I was trying to write some actual CSS, but in JSX, remember, we need to write our property names camel cased. So not line dash height, but line height like this. Let's also specify a margin of 0. And here let's actually say 1. So this probably won't change a lot yet, but it's going to be important later. So style. Okay, and now to finish, let's do what I said right in the very beginning, which is to basically allow the user of this component to set the maximum amount of stars. So the maximum rating. So coming back here, let's say that as the user of this component, I wanted to pass in the max rating, for example, as 5. Now then, maybe I wanted to use this component at some other place in my application, but here I wanted 10 stars. But now as we reload, of course, both of these components will only have 5 stars because we hard-coded that value here in our rating. So what we need to do is to now accept that prop here, max rating, and then use that right here. And so this is why we had to use this trick here instead of manually writing the number of stars. So instead of writing one element here per star. And so if I save this now, you see that indeed we get now 10 stars here. Great. But now what if someone used this component without specifying the max rating property? So since we're building a highly reusable component, we need to account for all these situations because we will never know who is actually going to use this component and what props they will specify. So we need to account that this might happen. So in this case, we have a problem because then, well, we have exactly no stars. So what we need to do is to set a default value for the rating. So how do we do that? Well, we can actually leverage the power of destructuring in JavaScript, because whenever we destructure an object, we can actually set a default value as we do so. And so here we are actually destructuring the props object. And so if max rating doesn't exist, we can set a default simply by writing this. And so if we save this now, then we are back to having our 5 stars by default. And so this is a very common way of setting default props in React applications. We will do this all the time as we go through the course. Next up, let's actually create the stars and make the component dynamic by reacting to a click event. So let's create a brand new component here. So function star, because the JSX code here is actually going to be a bit complex. But for now, we will want to return just the icon itself. So I actually already included that icon hidden here in the CSS file. So if you scroll all the way down here, you will find some code. Here it is. And so let's grab all of this comment. So all the way until the end, cut it from here and paste it down here. Then we can close the sidebar and this one. And so here we have the star icon as an SVG. So let's start here with the full star. So just this SVG, copy that and paste it here. And then let's use that star here. So instead of this, we will simply include the star. And then let's also define the key prop, and let's simply use I. So the current index, which is not ideal, but at least then React doesn't complain anymore. Give it a save, and nothing is happening here. Let's try that again. And let's inspect what we have here. So I was not expecting this. So we have indeed our stars here, but they appear to not have any height. And so let's try to fix that right here. So I will just wrap this SVG into a span element. Let's cut that from here, place it at the end. And then I will again define some style object out here. So let's say const star style equals, so width, let's say 48 pixels. And let's do the same for the height. Let's give it a display of block property as well, and setting the cursor to a pointer so that they behave a bit like a button. And so then we should also define the role property here for accessibility. So this is just HTML for accessibility. It has nothing to do with React. Okay, and then our star style. And there we go. So now we have our nice stars. Now they might be a bit too big here, but we will later allow the user to set the size. I'm just noticing that we have maybe enough space between them, and so let's remove this gap right here. Great. Now let's actually make our component dynamic, meaning that whenever we click on one of these stars, we then want to display the current rating here in this paragraph element. So, since we now want the UI to re-render based on an event, so we want something to happen on the screen, we need state. So let's create a new state variable called rating, of course, by using useState. And by default, let's set it to 0. Okay. Next, let's use that state. So as a second step, we include the rating prop right here. And so then we see 0. While that's maybe not so ideal, because if the rating is still 0, that simply doesn't mean that the user hasn't basically rated yet. So they haven't done anything. And so here, let's say that we either want the rating or an empty string. And so thanks to short circuiting, we will then move here to the second part of the operator whenever this is a falsy value. But of course, if we had 1 here, then we would see that 1. Now maybe just to clear the confusion a bit, let's remove these other 2 star ratings here. So working with just 1. And so where do we now need to listen for the click events? So basically when the user clicks here, then the rating should become 1. If they click here, then it should become 2, 3, 4, and 5. So what this means is that we need to listen for the click event on each of these stars. So let's start by defining a onClick prop here, which we will then later receive inside the star. So here we will now define a function which will actually set the rating. So let's say set rating, and then whatever the current index is plus 1. Because remember that array indexes start at 0, but our rating should start at 1. Okay. So now, of course, nothing will happen right now because we actually need to listen for that event on an HTML element. So like an JSX element. So what that means is that here we need to now accept that onClick handler. So this function that we defined right here and then use the onClick prop right here to then actually listen for the event and react to it. And if this is a bit confusing, then let's maybe change the name here from onClick to onRate. And so then it becomes really obvious that this is actually our own prop. So this is our own handler function. And we could, of course, even have created that separately. So onClick should be onRate. And so this is basically what we have been doing all the time, which is to pass an event handler function from the component that owns the state, so this one, right into a component that wants to actually update that state. So in this case, that's star. So we can make that even more explicit if we want. So we can say function handle rate or handle rating maybe. And then here we accept a rating, and all we do is then set rating, well, to that rating that we receive. And then here we can use that handle rating function. And so with this, we created a similar pattern to what we have done all the time. So creating a handler function in the component that owns the state, and then passing that handler function into some other child component which will actually update the state. Now here we are actually passing this function here, so not just this one, because here we need to fix the value of the rating that we want to be set for each star. Okay, that was a lot of explanation. Let's just reload here. And now as I click, you see that the state does indeed update. All right, so that's already working. And yeah, if this was a bit difficult for you to understand, then you can, as always, just pause the video here and analyze the code on your own. So what we did here is actually a bit similar to what we did in previous exercises. For example, I think in the accordion exercise, we did something very similar. Okay, and now to finish, what I want to do is to display only the amount of stars equal to the rating in full and all the other stars empty. So just like here. So here, if I click on the 5, then you see that 5 stars are full and the other ones are empty. And so here, let's now quickly do exactly the same thing. So we already have that other empty star right here. And so now we want to basically conditionally render either the full or the empty star. So let's grab this here. Let's cut it actually. And then here, let's enter JavaScript mode. So we will want to have a prop here for the star that says if this star is full. So we will take care of that later. But for now, let's just say, if the star is full, then render this part, so that SVG element, and if not, then render this one. All right, and so now, of course, full is undefined because we are not passing it in, and therefore all of the stars are empty right now. So how do we define whether a star is full or not? Well, it's actually pretty simple. So full should basically be a true or false value, right? That's why this conditional rendering here works. So again, when full is true, then this one will be rendered, and if it's false, then the empty star. So here we just want to now write a condition basically that will always be either true or false. So all we have to do is to say, is the current rating greater or equal I plus 1, which is always the rating for the currently generated star. And you see that immediately that worked here. Great. So let's again see why this actually works. So it all starts with this I variable right here. And so this comes from the index of the empty array that we create here with the length of max rating. So we create that array and then we immediately loop over it. And so then the first star that we create has the number 0. So this one is star 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We then use that index in order to handle our rating. So if we click on the very first star here, it will be 0 plus 1, and so it becomes 1. If we click on the third star here, well, then here the index is 2, and then 2 plus 1 makes 3. And so then the rating, as we see, is set to 3. And then, in order to determine whether a star is full or not, all we need to do is to compare the currently set rating to the index of the current star. So here the index is 0 plus 1, so here it's 1, here it's 2, here it's 3, 4, and 5. And so right now our rating is 3. And so here, of course, that 3 is greater than 1, here it's greater than 2, here it's greater or equal 3, and so it's still true, but then here it's of course false. So 3 is not greater or equal 4, and therefore this one here is then not full. So this condition will return false, which will then make the star being rendered as empty. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. And indeed, our component is now already almost working. All that is missing is this functionality of hovering the stars. And so let's take care of that in the next lecture. Let's now handle the event of users hovering over our stars. So basically the functionality that we're looking for is this one. So whenever we hover over these stars, we get like a temporary rating here exactly with the number of stars that are currently being hovered. So here we have 9, here we have 3, but it is completely independent from the rating that is actually set right now. So the rating is set to 5, but again, whenever we hover over some other number of stars, then that temporarily changes to that rating. All right, so what that means is that now we need a brand new piece of state to basically store that temporary rating. And again, that makes sense because something should happen on the screen, so the component should re-render whenever there is some hover event. That's how we then get that new rating in there. So let's say, for example, temp rating, which stands for temporary, and then set temp rating. And we start at 0, and of course the rating itself should also start at 0. All right. Now in order to actually handle that hover event, let's go down here onto our star, so into our star component, and then where we handle the click is where we also handle the hover. Now there's not really a hover event, but instead we have on mouse enter. So let's just do some console.log here for now. So that's one of them. And then we have mouse leave. So we basically need to handle these two separately. Okay, just so that we can quickly see. So I entered basically this element and then it said enter. And immediately afterwards, it said leave. So let's see again. And indeed, each time that we enter or leave, well, we get our log down there. And so now all we have to do is to update that temp rating state that we just created in each of these situations. So let's pass in then two handler functions here into the star, just like we did for the onRate. So let's call this one here on hover in, and the prop name here is different again from the event name, just to avoid some confusion here. So we could also call this prop on mouse enter again, but then it might be a bit confusing and you might think that the event is actually handled right here on the star component, which of course is not possible. So the event always needs to be handled on a JSX element itself. So like an HTML element, such as a span. Okay, and now all we have to do here is to basically set the temp rating to the rating of the current star. So that's again I plus 1, right? And then on hover out, we set it back to the initial value. So temp rating back to 0. So here we need to change the name. So of course this is with an uppercase R. And now all we need to do is to accept these two props here and wire everything together. So on hover in, on hover out. All right. And so then here we of course want to now call these functions. And here on hover out. And now finally we need to actually display this rating in the UI. So you see here right now that it's still yellow, which means that we haven't used it anywhere. So let's for now replace this rating with the temp rating. And then let's see. And yeah, that's already working. So see how that value was there. Shortly we had the 3, then here the 4, the 5, and so on and so forth. So that's working great. The only part that is not working is that the stars are not getting full. And so let's quickly fix that here inside this condition here. So here we can say that if there is a temp rating, so if there is a temporary rating, then do the same thing, but with that temp rating. So then temp rating greater or equal I plus 1. But if not, well, then we just do what we had before. And so this should fix that. And yeah, beautiful. So that works great. And if we click here, well, then the number disappears, but the stars stay the same. And so that's because now we have the rating set. And then so here in this full prop, we enter the second branch, which then, just like before, sets these 4 stars here to full. Now all we have to do here is to place another OR here and say, basically, if there is no temp rating, then display the current rating. And if that also doesn't exist, well, then we get the empty string. So indeed, we now get 4. If we click again, we get 5. But as we hover, we get the temporary rating. So just like we wanted, and just like this component here works as well. So this looks really nice, really real world, actually. And it wasn't that much work. All we had to do is some tricks with these 2 rating states and then handling all of these different events. So basically handling the click, the mouse enter, and the mouse leave. And the result, if you ask me, is even a bit magical here. So I really, really like this effect that we created here. Okay, and so that's the main functionality already implemented. But now let's make the component really, really flexible by allowing a couple of props. So we will learn all about that in the next lecture, and then we will come back here and create the API, basically, of this component. When we build a reusable component like the one we are currently building, we should carefully think about what props the component needs. So let's now shortly look at how to think about props. So first of all, as we start working on our components, we should get into the mindset that any component is always created by someone and always consumed by someone. Now, when you're working on your own, the component creator and consumer is of course the same person. But if you're on a team, those might very well be different developers. But in any case, it's always a good idea to think in terms of there being a creator and a consumer of a component. So different entities, even if it's just yourself. So basically, the creator is the person building a component and defining what props the component can accept, while the consumer uses the component somewhere in the application by specifying values for the props. Now, the reason for the separation between creator and consumer, even if you're just working on your own, is that if we have this mindset, we can think of the component's props as the public API of the component. So, as a component creator, when we choose what props the consumer is allowed to pass in, we are essentially defining the public interface of our component. And at the same time, we are choosing how much complexity of the component we want to expose to the consumer of the API. Because in the end, a component is basically just an abstraction. So we are encapsulating a part of the UI and the associated logic into a component and allow consumers to interact with that component via props. And that's it. That's basically what creating a new component is. But anyway, when we decide about what props to allow in a component, we need to find a good balance on how strict we want to be. So about how many props we want to enable for configuration. For example, let's say we're building a weather component. So a component that simply displays the weather. We could make it extremely simple, for example, only allowing one prop. So for the location for which the consumer wants the weather. Now, this might be perfectly fine, but it might also make the component not flexible enough, or maybe even straight out useless for the consumer. On the other hand, we could allow props for the URL of the weather data, the number of days, whether it should be daily or hourly, how many days, which temperature to unit, what data should be displayed, and so on. I could think of really 20 other props here, but the point is that exposing so many props might make the component way too hard to use for the consumer because we're exposing too much complexity. And speaking of complexity, you will end up with very complex code if you want to allow so many props. So when deciding on the right API for your components, try to strike the right balance between too little and too many props, and a balance that works well for both the creator and the consumer of the component based on the project's needs. Now, if for some reason you really need to expose so many props, make sure to at least provide some good default values for many of them. Okay, and as always, this will come to you with practice, but I thought that it was quite important to get you into this mindset of distinguishing between component creators and consumers. And so with that, we're ready to put this into practice. Okay, so let's now make our component really flexible and reusable by defining a nice public API for consumers to use it. So right now, our component is quite unflexible and therefore not really reusable. So it might maybe be useful in one very specific case where we want the component to look and behave exactly like this, but it won't be useful for many other consumers. So if we imagine that we want to reuse this component in many other applications, or maybe even publish it to NPM to share it with all React developers around the world, then they will probably not find this component very useful right now. So those developers, or in other words, those consumers, they will probably want to define things like the colors of the stars, or maybe the sizes of the stars and the text, in order to basically make this component fit into their own applications. And so what we're going to do now is to try to define a good public API for this component, just as we learned before. And so by doing that, we will try to find that balance of using too few props and using too little props, so that the component also doesn't get way too complex. So let's get to work, and let's actually start with those two simple things that I just mentioned. So the color and the size. So let's just write that here, color and size. And as I mentioned also in the last lecture, it's a good idea to provide default values. So we already learned that we can do that by providing the default values during destructuring. So just like we did with the max rating. And so let's say that our default color will be this yellow of FCC419. And the default size, let's make it the number of 48. Okay. And now let's use these props in our component. So to basically accept the color and then change the stars and the text to fit that color. And the same for the size. So I want to start with the text. And so now I actually need to take this object here back into the component, because now we will specify some properties which will depend on the props. And so the props are of course only accessible inside the component. So then this object will have to live inside the component as well. So the color property will be set to color. And so we can actually just do it like this. And if we give this a save, then you see the text does indeed turn yellow. Now it might be a bit small. And so let's now also use the size. And so let's use a template literal and then use the size that we received as a prop and set the pixels to that. Well, that's maybe a bit too large. Let's try to divide this, for example, by 1.5, and that looks a bit nicer. All right, and now we should also use these values here, of course, for the stars themselves. So to do that, we will also now place this style object inside the star, and then we need these values also here. So the color and the size. And so of course, then we need to pass them in here as props. So color and size and size. And so then here we can again create a template literal, get the size, and then pixels. Let's do the same for the height. And here nothing changed because we already had 48 here. And now finally the color is actually defined right in the SVG elements. So here we have the fill and the stroke of black, which is the reason why these are currently black. But if we change that here, like this, so color, then you see that they just turned yellow. Now, of course, this other one isn't yellow yet because, well, it is still at black. So let's change that here as well. Okay, beautiful. So that's already a lot nicer than before. Let's just call another component here. And let's define some other size here. Let's say 24. And so here we have a much smaller component, but which still works in the same way. And of course, we can also specify the color, let's say red. And so with this, we just made our component a lot more flexible. So if someone wants to use this component in an application where the main color is red, then they can now easily change all of this to red. Now, sometimes consumers or users of the component want to have even more control over the styling. So sometimes it's a good idea to allow users to pass in a class name. So for example, a class name with the name of test, just in this case, which will then come from some CSS file in the application where this component is being used. So right now we don't have any class like this, but this is just really for testing purposes. So then here we need to accept the class name. And by default, it will just be an empty class name. And then we just add it here to the overall container. So class name, and then class name like this. So for example, if the user wants to somehow change the font style, they can do that right inside this class name that they pass in. And so that class name will then be added here and will then change the font family of our component. Now, another thing that I sometimes see on the web when we have a component like this is that instead of just displaying the rating number, is that they display like some message according to the rating. So in order to do that, we could pass in an array, and let's actually do that here. So we could pass in an array of messages, for example, saying that the first value is terrible, the second one is bad, then we have okay, good, well, as a string, and then amazing. And so now we can display these 5 values here, so these strings, instead of the numbers. So that's another nice touch that we can give our component here. So then we accept that prop here. And by default, let's make it an empty array. So really, really important to always give default values. And so now here we can use those values. However, we want, of course, to only use that messages array in case that there actually are some elements in there. And also the number of elements should be correct. So for example, if we allow for a rating between 1 and 5, but then we only have 3 elements in the array, then that doesn't make a lot of sense. So this wouldn't work. And so here, what we can do is to just check if messages.length is equal to the max rating. And if that is the case, then that means that a messages array was passed in. And if not, then we just do exactly what we had before. But in this case, let's then just display the messages at position rating -1 in order to convert back to 0-based index. And of course, we should also consider the temporary rating. So let's actually just copy what we have here, or maybe not. Okay, it's not that similar. So let's come here and say, if there is a temp rating, then use temp rating -1. And if not, then just use the regular rating -1. So again, if this looks confusing, then just make sure to pause the video and analyze that code. But this is just normal JavaScript at this point. But anyway, as you see, this works great now. So 1 star means terrible, bad, then it starts to become okay, good, and finally amazing. And of course, it also works with the not temporary rating, so with the fixed rating. While here, this other component where the messages array is empty, so that's the default here. So here it's empty, and so therefore we are still displaying just the number. Great. And let's keep going, because there is still at least one important thing missing, and that is to allow the consumer to set a default rating. Okay, so that's not very hard. So let's say, for example, that the user wants to start with a default of 3. Default rating should be 3. So the consumer might want to specify a prop like this. And so let's now then add that prop here and give it a default value. Now by default, the rating should be 0, which is exactly why that's what we put here, right? And so the default rating should be just that, 0. But of course, now we need to use this default rating, and we will use it right here instead of that 0. So basically, we will initialize our rating state with whatever default rating comes into the prop. And if that prop is not specified, then that's simply exactly the 0 that we had before. Now, maybe you heard or read that we should never initialize state from props. However, this is only true if you want the state variable to stay in sync with that passed in props. Or in other words, if you want the state value to update in case that the prop value is also updated. However, that is clearly not the case here. So we are really only using this default rating here basically as seed data. So really just as the initial state. And we don't care whether this value here maybe changes somewhere else in the application, so outside this component. And therefore, this is perfectly fine and normal to do. All right? So it's really no problem to initialize your state based on a prop. So I just wanted to address this point because I could already hear some people complaining about this. So this was more relevant in the old days of React before we had hooks, but now that's really no longer a problem. But anyway, as we save this now, you see that immediately we see the 3 ratings or the 3 stars as the default here. And of course, if this was 1 or 2, then that's what we will see there. And so again, that's just because we are now using this number 2 as the initial state value of our rating. All right. And now we could keep going here, of course, and add a lot more different props. So allowing for a lot more configuration. For example, we could say that we want the colors here to change according to the rating, or we could allow for some different spacing between the stars. We could also allow the consumer to specify on which side this text label here appears. So maybe they want it on the left or at the top or at the bottom here. But that might be going a bit too far here and maybe specifying too many props and adding too much complexity. So I think that what we have here right now is more than enough, except for one important thing that we are still missing right now. And that thing is the fact that the consumer might actually need this rating state outside of this component. And to exemplify this, let's come again back here. And what I want to do now, just temporarily, is to create a new component right here. Let's call it test. And so this component is then the one that will include the star rating. And let's say the color in this case is blue. Why not? And then let's also include that down here. And you will see why I'm doing this in this way in a minute. Okay, so here we have another one and a blue one. But now let's say that for some reason they also really needed to display this rating somewhere in their user interface. So for example, they might have a paragraph saying this movie was rated X stars. So here let's actually already use a max rating of 10. And so now what they want to happen is that whatever rating we specify here should then be displayed right here in the user interface. So now it should say here that the movie was rated 7 stars. So how will they do this right now? So they basically need access to the state, so to this rating state that we have inside the component, but right here. So inside of the test component. So what they need is some state. So let's say movie rating and set movie rating. And then use state. And let's again set it to 0. And then here let's use that movie rating. But of course, this now will not change at all when we rate the movie right here. So we need a way to update this state here whenever the state inside this component is updated as well. So how do we do that? Well, basically, we want to give the consumer of this component the ability to pass in a set function. So basically, we want them to allow to specify an onSet rating handler. And so in this case, what this component wants to pass in is simply this function right here. Okay, so let's now specify then this prop here. So we want to accept this very important prop right here. And this one by default doesn't need any default value. All right, and now it's very simple. All we have to do here is on the handle rating is to not only set the internal rating, but also to basically set the external rating. So we can now just say on set rating, also set that external rating. And with this, we now gave the outside test component basically the ability to get access to that internal state right inside this component. Okay, and now if we change this here, you see that it did indeed get updated to 7. So this additional configuration, so this final prop that we updated here, or that we actually added here to our component, was really, really important. Because without this, this component would really just be presentational in the end. I mean, it contains some state internally, but from the perspective of the test component, we couldn't really touch that state in any way. And therefore, we couldn't use that state inside this component, which then, again, wouldn't make this component really useful. Okay, so this was the final prop that we added. And as I said, we could keep going and get really crazy here with our configuration options. And you could, of course, if you wanted, allow some other things, such as the ones that I have mentioned earlier. But we will just leave it as this, because I think this right now is a pretty good balance. Now there's just one final thing that we need to do here in our component, which is to prevent the user basically to pass in some values that we do not want. So here, for example, this shouldn't be a string, right? Because, well, then this wouldn't work at all. So we need to make sure that this is actually a number here. And so let's look at something called prop types in the next lecture. To finish this component, let's now add type checking to the component's props using prop types. So with prop types, we can basically specify the type of value that we expect the consumer of the component to pass in for each of the props. For example, we can define that this max rating here really must be a number and nothing else. And this is what we call type checking. So again, checking each type of the prop and specifying what type they need to have. Now, if you really care about this, you should actually just use TypeScript instead of JavaScript. Now, I will show you how to use React's built-in prop types, because it actually does make a lot of sense for this reusable component, but I will not do this in the rest of the course for all the components that we're going to build, because that just takes too much time, and also developers these days don't really do this anymore. Again, if this is really important for your app, you can just use TypeScript instead of JavaScript, which is what many teams and many developers started doing, again, instead of using prop types. But anyway, let's now actually use prop types, and for that, we import the prop types object from the prop types package. So there's no need to install this prop types package here in this case, because Create React App already comes with this package pre-installed. But we do need to import it here, so just as we did here, because it is actually a separate package from React itself. Okay, and now in order to do the type checking, let's use our component, so that's star rating, and then on this component we specify the prop types property. And here it's important that we write it with a lower case. So prop types, and then here we then assign those prop types an object. So again, we imported prop types here with the capital P, but the property name here is with this lowercase p. Okay, and now here for each of the props we can specify the type. So let's say max rating, and so that's exactly the name of the prop that we have here. And then now we actually use that prop types object that we imported in the very beginning. And so now all we need to do is to use one of the validators that is inside this object. So here we can simply say prop types dot number. And that's it. So let's say that here we import this star rating, and instead of specifying a number, we specify a string. And so then here we get this problem, or this warning here, which says invalid prop of max rating. And that's because it has the type of string instead of the expected number. And it is these warnings right here that will then allow other developers to catch bugs like this. Because, I mean, no one would specify this here on purpose, but by mistake, we might end up here with a string. So for example, also this could happen. So we could specify the 5 here, but as a string, and then we would still get the same problem. Now the code does actually work with this here somehow. So JavaScript is somehow able to coerce the types into a number. But again, here we get this warning because we really should specify this not as a string, but as a number. And so then of course, this disappears. Now we can also chain the is required property here, which just as the name says, will then make this prop required. So somewhere here we probably have one without. Yeah, so this one doesn't have the max rating, and then immediately we get this warning down here. All right, but in our case, we actually have some default values for all of our props already defined. And so it doesn't make sense then to mark any of them as required. So by default, you shouldn't use this one. So instead, just use default values for all or most of your props. But anyway, now let's keep going and let's make this really complete. So the default rating should also be a number. Then the color should be a string. And so we basically have one of these validators here for all the types that we can imagine. So this one is also a number. Then we have the messages. And so here we have prop types.array. Let's see what else we have. So we also have the class name, which is a string. So here I wrote the wrong one. So always use the uppercase prop types. And now finally the on set rating prop. So prop types, and this one is a func, which stands for function. Okay, and besides these two, we also have a .bool, which stands for a boolean, so if it's a true or false value, and we also have object. So in this case, we have none of these, and so this one is just a function. Okay, and that's actually all that we have to do. And as you see here, adding prop types is also a nice way of documenting our components, because this type definition right here makes it really obvious what kind of data we are expecting. But as I said in the very beginning, I will not start using this in all components from now on. So this was mostly just to show you that you can use this yourself in case that you have some component like this, which you want to make highly reusable across multiple applications or even just inside one application. And if at the same time you don't want to switch to TypeScript. But in any case, with this, we finished our reusable component and we also reached the end of this section. All we have left to do is one final coding challenge to practice what we just learned here in this section. Welcome to another coding challenge. And I hope that you really are finding these useful. And if you do, then it's now time to build a reusable text expander component. So here I have 3 of these text expander components that we are going to build. So a text expander is basically when we have some part of a text and then we have this kind of button here that when we click it will reveal the entirety of the text. And then when we click it again, it will go back to hiding it. So this one here is basically one of the text expander components. And then here we have another one. And immediately you see that this one has by default a lot more text. And then this button here has some different text than this one and also a different color. But then when we click it, the behavior is exactly the same. Then finally, we have another one. And you see that this one has some different styling. And also by default, it is open. And so then when we click here, it will close. So let's go here to the starter code, which as always, I have attached as a link to this lecture. And if for some reason you don't want to build this challenge here on Code Sandbox, just copy paste the code from here and also from the CSS file. So that's not a lot, but we will still need that. All right. So here I already have the 3 components included inside the app, and the component itself right now only renders this to do. And so, yeah, this here is your to do. So to build this expander right here. Now, by including these 3 text expanders here, I'm already giving you a hint into what the public API of this reusable component will look like. Because here we already used many of these props. And so from this, you can kind of imagine what each of them does in order to achieve the 3 results that we saw here. So the challenge for you is to now actually go ahead and implement this text expander using everything that we have learned up until this point. And if for some reason this is a bit difficult, then just imagine this as a collaboration between you and me, basically. So you build as much as you can on your own, and then if you can't move on anymore at some point, you simply watch the rest of the video, where I will then basically help you completing this component. And if you want, you can of course also go crazy with this one and include even a lot more props than just the ones that you see here. So you can really do a lot of customization here if you want, but of course it's also more than enough to just do what we have here. So this is a really nice exercise, which I hope you will complete, or at least part of it, and then I see you back here with my implementation. Okay, and let's get to work. And I will immediately start by copying all these prop names here. So selecting them one by one, then copy, and then I will just receive them here. Then of course, just some commas. And then we can get to work. And in fact, we are actually missing one, which is basically just the text here. So of course, inside of the expander, we need access to the text. Now this text is between the opening and the closing tag. And so what that means is that this is the children of this component. So it's going to be inside the children prop. So to start, we can actually immediately render that here, just so we see that this works. And indeed, here we get the 3 pieces of text that we have right here. Great. So we already have part of the output, but of course we also want that button. So let's do that. And here let's immediately allow the user to pass in a class name. So in this last one here, the user passes in this box class name. And so here we then accept that. And so then let's add it right here. So class name equals class name, like this. And so this is exactly what we also did in our reusable star rating component, right? Now in that example, we didn't actually have a class name, but now we have. And so immediately you see that this third one here got this different styling. Okay. Now let's place this text here inside a span so that then we can add the button. All right. And now the text of the button can actually be customized. So that is what we have the prop of the collapse button text for. So let's get that, place that here, and then we have some error. So let's see what's happening. Now we're not closing the span, so that doesn't look too good. And so here we already have one button. Now here then we have this like kind of very small button which doesn't have any text. And so that's because only this second text expander is actually passing in the text for the collapse button text property. And so that's because this text here, so this label of the button, is different from the default. So if we take a look here, then you see that by default, this one and this one display the text show more. And so then this one here is different and it says show text. So yeah, this one here is show text. And here it is actually expand. Okay, so expand button text should be by default show more. And so now here we have show more, then this one that's different, show text, and then again show more right here. But now, of course, we want something to happen when we click on this button. So we want only part of the text here to be visible. So we need some state, right? So let's call this is expanded and set is expanded. Use state, and then by default, let's make it false. So by default, the text should not be expanded. So we only want to see a small piece of the text. All right. And just make sure that your use state was correctly imported. Okay. And now let's use this is expanded state in order to calculate or to compute the text that we actually want to display here. So let's do that in a separate variable and let's call it the display text. So if it is expanded, so if expanded is true, then we want all the text to be shown. And so that's then the children, right? So children is that text. That's why we placed that here in the beginning, right? But if not, then we want something else. So let's just write test there just to experiment. And then we will, of course, replace the children here with that display text. And so by default, now all 3 of them have this test here, which is this part. And so again, that's because by default is expanded is false. Now, actually, if we take a look at one of these components here, then this last one will have the prop of extended equals true. So right here, I don't have that. So I have this one, but in the starter file that you will see, I will not have this one but instead expanded. Okay, so again, in the starter file that I had here, I had a mistake. So we had the wrong prop here, and instead we want an expanded prop and not this one. So here it's not button inline, but expanded. But in the code that you see, this will already have been fixed. So the meaning of this expanded prop is that if it is set to true, then by default, the component here will be expanded. And so that's exactly this third situation right here. So if we reload this one here, then you see that the third text expander is by default already expanded. Okay, and so that's because expanded is set to true. So here, let's now actually not use false, but really get this initial state from expanded. And so then we can set expanded to false by default. And so this is very similar what we also did in our star rating component. So there we also set the initial state based on one of the props, right? So by default, we now have this last one here already opened. And so this one shows the entire text, while these ones here for now only show test. Now another thing is that in this case that the text is expanded, here the text, so the label of this button should be different. So it should be show less by default. And so let's do that here again as a default prop. So show less. And so then here, let's conditionally display that text. So if is expanded, then show the collapse button text, and if not, then show the expand button text. And so now it says show less. And so this other component here will then show collapse text instead of show less. So because it passes in this special prop that we have defined here. And if all of these props here and all these default values here look very confusing to you, well, that's just because we are really trying to make this component here very flexible and reusable. So just like we did with our star rating component. When we build our normal components in applications, we will not do this, right? We will then usually have the text directly in here, for example, instead of relying on the props and on default values of those props. But again, here we are striving for maximum reusability. But anyway, let's now finally actually make this button work. So, specifying the onClick prop. Here we just need a function, and then let's say set is expanded. And then the new state will be based on the current state. So we use the callback function here. And instead of writing the entire word, let's just say exp, which stands for expanded. And then we just toggle that here. And that's it. So let's see. And indeed, as we click there, the text is now hidden. And if we click on one of these, then it will show the text. And again, it will then hide it. Great. Now, next up, let's take care of not displaying the test here, but instead displaying some actual part of the text. Now, notice how here we have this prop, which says collapsed number of words. And so here, let's again specify a default, which is 20. But of course, it could also be any other value. So the idea here is that by default, when the text is collapsed, it will only display exactly this number of words. So only 20 words. But then you have, for example, this component here, which shows more words. So 20, this one should then actually be 10, so that this one here shows, in fact, more words. So by default, only 10 words should be displayed. So let's do that. So this is just some standard string and array manipulation. So we can simply split this string by the empty space, which will then give us an array. And then we can slice, or in other words, we can take all the elements from 0 all the way to collapsed number of words. So by default, we take the first 10 words. So from 0 to 10. And now this is still an array, and so we need to put it back to being a string. And then we also want to add at the end these 3 dots. Okay. And we could have used a template literal for this, but we can also just add them here at the end like this. So that works the same way. And so, as we click here, it shows all of them. And otherwise, it just shows exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 words plus these 3 dots. Beautiful. So that is already working. Now all we have to do is to take care of the styling of this button. So let's again specify an object here. Let's say button style. And then background, set it to none. Also no border. And again, this is necessary because we want this component here to be 100% reusable and standalone. So it cannot depend on any external styles. So let's also set a cursor to pointer. Let's give it some margin on the left side of 4 pixels, or let's say 6. And finally, we also want to give it a text color. And so this is where this button color prop comes into play. So let's grab that and place that here. And now all we have to do is to assign this here to the style prop. So style, button style, give it a save, and beautiful. So now this button looks more like text, but it is still missing some color. So let's by default add some blue color here, which is 1F09 CD. All right, and there we go. So the second one again is personalizing not only these 2 texts here on the button, but also the color and the number of words. And so that's why this one here looks quite different. And then again, this one here has this special styling here that's coming right from our CSS file in the form of this box class. Great, so this is working. And in fact, we are now basically finished. So this text expander component is now highly reusability, and it hides all the complexity from the user, so from the consumer of this component, which again is really nice and really important. So as the developer of this component, then we chose the public API basically, and therefore allowed the user to customize it to their needs. And as always, we could have gone really crazy here and, for example, allow the user to place this button here in different places, like below or on the left side or here right at the very beginning. We could have allowed some more styling here of the entire component, or we could also allow the user to specify whether they want to see these 3 dots here or not. But again, that's just not necessary, because with this we found a nice balance. So this is the interface that we chose.